This is the Twin City News Around Town. A closer look at the people, places, and events around Batesburg, Leesville, Gilbert, and the Ridge. Presented by the Twin City News, Batesburg, Leesville's community journalism since 1925.
Welcome into this edition of TCN Around Town, the Twin City News podcast. I'm Tony Ballman. Thank you for joining me here on this Tuesday in South Carolina and beyond. And, we had a little rain this morning, but nothing like the rains that come during a hurricane. And we're about 2 weeks into hurricane season here, which runs from June 1st to November 30th. And I honestly did not know that, actually up until a couple of weeks ago, that handicapping hurricanes is a thing. And you learn something new every day. And I am on board now with our guest on the podcast today. He is James Murphy, and he is with SportsInsider.com. And odds making is his thing. James, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here. I really like the weather today. It was like Pacific Northwest weather here in South Carolina, which is a rarity for June.
It is, and you are in South Carolina, so
That is correct.
You're here in the Palmetto State. And,
yeah, I'm in Lexington, right up, right outside Columbia. So,
I could have driven up the road to see you, man.
You should have, man. Could have gone grab some barbecue or something. 13
miles apart, but
wow, where are you guys at?
We're Batesburg, Leesville.
Wow, you are right around the corner.
So we're right down the road. But well, first of all, talk to me a little bit about for folks who don't know, what exactly is an odds maker?
An odds maker, basically, as the name implies, sets odds on typically on sporting events, like lines on football games, or in Europe, soccer is kind of the big sport. But he can do odds on anything. Political betting, for example, has become a lot more popular, and there's a lot of what we call novelty bets that have become popular, including weather bets, which is kind of the reason we're here today.
Exactly. Now, South Carolina obviously doesn't have parimutuel betting or anything else like that, but the internet certainly has opened up the idea of getting involved in these games of prognostication / chance / odds making.
That is correct. There's been some talk of South Carolina having legal betting at some point. Again, I'll believe it when I see it. But right now there are 22 states that have legalized sports betting since the Supreme Court struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act probably a year and a half ago at this point. And, people, it's popular with people, and it brings in really good revenue.
Well, and we've got, in Camden and Aiken, we've got two really hotbeds of horsing activity. And of course, you've got resort areas like Myrtle Beach and Charleston that certainly could lend themselves to that sort of thing if the doors would open up on parimutuel betting.
Yeah, that's correct. There's a number of ways to do it. Tennessee's done it entirely online, and they're not going to have any retail sports betting anywhere in the state, but they're setting up a licensing process for online sports betting, which is one way to handle it. Really, there hasn't been the only state that's done a good job of it, the only new state since the PASPA was struck down, is Colorado, who they're going to be the next big sports betting state. They may even surpass Nevada in a few years. So
it's basically Nevada and New Jersey, right? Because you got those betting centers of Las Vegas and Atlantic City.
Yeah, the majority of sports betting is done online, so you really don't need the big betting centers. Colorado's got casinos in 3 kind of small mountain towns, and that's the only place in the state they have casinos, but they can offer sports betting online anywhere in the state. And as it has been the case in New Jersey, well over 90% of sports betting is done online or via mobile devices.
Yeah, well, and so you can pretty much bet on anything. And
you really can.
One of the reasons I wanted to get you on board is I had no idea that an odds maker would spend any kind of time talking about the weather. But in fact, you have. You are among the folks that are actually laying a line on hurricane season. Talk to me about how that happened.
Well, there's actually some precedent for it. There's such a thing in the futures market, on the commodity markets,
Yeah.
where you can buy futures contracts, basically positioning yourself against bad weather. You're essentially betting whether there will or won't be a hurricane. So if I owned say I owned a hotel on the beach in Myrtle Beach or somewhere, and obviously a hurricane would be a concern, I could buy a futures contract that would protect me in the event of a hurricane. And they have other ones too. Like I grew up in Utah, which is obviously a big ski resort area. And the ski resorts there, they can buy futures contracts to protect them against a season where they don't have any snow, which obviously is bad for their bottom line. So there's some precedent on this, at a kind of a more elite level of finance. And in Europe, Europe's kind of the gold standard as far as betting on unusual events. And they've been betting on the weather for decades now. Like you can find bets of will there be snow in London on Christmas Day, or what will the high temperature be during the summer. So a couple of years ago, the people I work for, we were talking about some ideas for odds. They said, well, how about a hurricane season? And it's actually pretty easy because there's so much statistical data on hurricanes.
Yes.
They leave behind a trail of statistical data, and there's a lot of meteorologists who either professionally or in their spare time like to predict hurricanes and how many there's going to be and the severity. And once you give me any type of probability, I can convert that into a betting line. And there's plenty of data to work with. So there you go.
Well, I know I was looking at some information that came out that NOAA right now, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, they're predicting that there's going to be a 60% chance of an above normal hurricane season and 30% at about a normal hurricane season. And based on what we've had in the past 14 days plus, actually we've had some storms pre-hurricane season,
which is unusual.
It looks like it's going to be an active hurricane season ahead.
Yeah, it's that's what NOAA has said. I've done a lot of research on the correlation, and the hurricanes are really unpredictable. Despite all the predictions and despite all the forecasting tools they have now, they remain unpredictable. And there's not a lot of correlation between, say, number of tropical storms and how many hurricanes you have. There's been seasons where they have a ton of tropical storms, but very few hurricanes. And additionally, there's very little correlation between the number of hurricanes and the number of severe hurricanes. So you can have a season that's full of mild hurricanes. I guess that's a relative term, but basically a severe hurricane is considered Category 4 or Category 5, and there's quite a few seasons where there's a big net number of hurricanes, but not a lot of severe hurricanes. And then there's some seasons where there's one or two hurricanes, one of them's really bad. So there's not a lot of causality, and you would think logically that if there's a lot of tropical storms, there'll be a lot of hurricanes, but that's not the case. So especially here in South Carolina, we kind of are in a weird place. And if you watch, if you've gone back and paid attention to the hurricanes, it seems like there's a lot of times they threaten the South Carolina coast, but they very seldom hit the South Carolina coast. So they
veer off to the right or whatever.
Yeah, the joke I always say is, they kind of buffet the South Carolina coast and then hit Wilmington like they always do. And that's kind of the case. And over time, you kind of figure, well, there must be something, in the jet stream or whatever that's causing that. So you put these little things into account, and that's kind of how we come up with the odds for the individual cities. We kind of look at past performance data, as we would call it, for a sport, and we just come up with a number that way.
So you're not actually you're not spitballing, you're not just throwing darts at the wall.
Oh, no.
You're actually sitting there and looking at climate data, you're looking at meteorological data to come up with these odds.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I was for a long time, I was a sports handicapper, and people would pay me to give them advice on football betting or, sports betting. And a lot of people say, wow, you must have a great job. But, I was living in Las Vegas. People thought it was like all golf and strippers. But I basically spent 16 hours a day in front of a spreadsheet.
You mean it's not? You mean it's not all golfers and strippers?
Surprisingly enough, it's not. It was more, take out tacos at 3 a.m. With my dog and staring at a spreadsheet. And hurricanes aren't much different. Another thing I've done every year for the past few years is the number of shark bites that they have annually, which they also keep very detailed records on. And it's the same thing. You're looking at spreadsheets about shark bites. And so it's really not a lot of difference, from my perspective, between hurricanes and the NFL.
Wow. I mean, you could open up a whole other industry here in South Carolina about handicapping the number of jellyfish stings.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'm going to work on alligator bites because, recently South Carolina had the first alligator fatality in history.
Wow.
Some woman basically thought she should get into a pond to get a closer look at an alligator, which, surprise, surprise, turned out to be a bad idea. And unfortunately, it was a fatally bad.
Yeah,
idea.
Unfortunately, that's. But I think you would say that if you jump into a pond in South Carolina, I'd say there's a fairly high percentage you're going to encounter something that you don't want to encounter.
I typically try to avoid ponds in South Carolina for that reason. You never know whether you're going to find a corpse or an alligator or, God only knows what else.
Water moccasins. I mean,
some strange fish that you didn't know existed. So, I try to stay out of the ponds.
So people will actually, based on what you lay out, people will actually put money down on how many hurricanes are going to hit a specific area, how many are going to make landfall versus not. I mean, if I'm a guy who, has a little bit of money and wants to do something like that, and remember, I'm a journalist, so this is a hypothetical.
Yeah.
It's
all research.
Absolutely a hypothetical. But I could actually do that. I could go out and just.
That's correct.
What could I bet on?
Well, most of it's done in Europe. As far
really?
As, most of the weather betting's done in Europe, particularly in England. They love that stuff. Right now, there's probably nowhere in the United States you could walk in and do it at a retail sports book, and that's more due to regulation than anything else. And I think that's going to change, basically due to the recent pandemic, because sports books found themselves without any sports to put on the board. So they started to get creative and find new things to offer lines on. And I think you're going to see a lot more creativity and variety within the next few years, because they don't ever want to be in that position again where there's nothing that they can take bets on. So most of it's in Europe. There's a lot. I was actually looking at a sports book in Russia just about an hour ago, looking at their lines on. They have lines where you can bet the weather, like the high temperature in various airports around the world, like the major airports, like Budapest or London or whatever. They have the data there. You can bet on it. So if you were in Europe, you would have not a problem at all finding a place to bet on the weather.
So that's what Edward Snowden and Julian Assange are doing. They're sitting over there in their exile, just placing bets on when it's going to snow in London, huh?
I would like to think so. And that's but the weather. It sounds kind of funny at first, but as I said about the hurricanes, there's a lot of data on it, and what you learn. People think, well, the NFL sports betting is one thing, but all these novelty bets are another. But what you learn is if the data is out there to work with, you can successfully not only set a line on it, but handicap it. And you could make some very intelligent bets on just about anything.
So I don't want you to give away your industry secrets right now, but how's it looking for what's the line on South Carolina getting busted pretty good?
In terms of the hurricane, it's pretty high. I don't have my data right here in front of me, but as I said, South Carolina is in a weird position because technically we should be vulnerable to hurricanes, but they always seem to basically track up northward. They might hit Myrtle Beach, but typically they kind of hit around the Outer Banks or Wilmington or somewhere on the North Carolina coast. So we're kind of very fortunate here, and I don't think in a given year we got a really good chance of being hit by a hurricane. There might be one offshore that causes some bad weather, but as far as it making landfall, that's a totally different matter.
Well, now see, you lived in Utah. I lived in the Midwest for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I had my first snowfall when I went up to run a paper up there. First time I'd ever had to slide down a hill to get to work. And I would imagine come wintertime, if the rest of the traditional books are not available, that folks might get into the old talking over coffee. Hey, are we going to get snow in South Carolina this year?
Yeah, and again, that's something that there's not a lot of good data on snowfall in South Carolina, unlike Utah, where you can get just great, just very detailed data on it, because obviously not only is there a big economic, correlation to all the amount of snow they get, but they just have more people researching snowfall there. South Carolina, I would say were I setting a line, I would make it probably a fairly big underdog that we'd get any type of significant snow. Maybe an inch or so that melts by midday, but as far as a actual snowstorm where we get like maybe 4 more inches, I think it's very unlikely.
There are going to be folks who are going to watch this or listen to it and say, "Yeah, isn't that kind of morbid to be out there betting on whether a Category 5 is going to slam in a la 1989 into Charleston and things like that?" How would you answer those that say betting on things like that is kind of a morbid pursuit?
That's a real good question, and a lot of people have asked me that. For my job, I take it very seriously. I'm not looking to get basically come up with sensationalism to get people to put eyeballs on the website. We've talked about at various points doing odds on things, and if the data is not there, if I can't come up with a good line on it, I'm not going to do it, no matter how controversial it is. And it's kind of like the financial markets; they're pretty much agnostic. When you buy stocks, you'll buy stocks in a certain thing based on, like when the pandemic first started, a lot of pharmaceutical stocks took off. And so there was a correlation between how much money you can make and how many people would get sick and presumably die from that. So, it's kind of an agnostic thing. I just am setting a line. I don't really make a moral judgment on what you should or should not bet on. Just like the stock market doesn't make a moral judgment on, whether you should buy stocks in a pharmaceutical company or a cruise line.
It's a numbers game.
It's a numbers game. And, if it was something that I wasn't very proud of my work and didn't put a lot of time and effort into it, I might be a little less, less eager to say that I don't really have an issue with it, but I don't have an issue with it just basically because I know that, I treat it with a high degree of seriousness, and, it's never something that we just put up on the site just to, basically be a morbid, some sort of shock value thing. I've done odds on plane crashes before when the 737 MAX, the Boeing plane had all that trouble. And, I did it in kind of a way that basically was reassuring to the public, just kind of explaining to them just how unlikely it is that they'll be in a plane crash. And, some people, understand that best in percentages and fractions, and some people understand that best in betting lines. And, it's just another way of expressing probabilities at the end of the day.
Well, we've talked about hurricanes. We've even talked about betting on alligators. But it is the silly season. And so, it is going to be the season before long where bets are going to be taken, I'm sure, on donkeys and elephants. And you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, that is correct. That is correct. I'm actually considered something of an authority on political betting. I've been on Fox News, I've been on the Washington Post. I've had a number of people interview me based on my knowledge of betting on politics, specifically the presidential race. And not to toot my own horn, but during the last election, our site, and me in particular, we were one of the first people to say, hey, Trump's got a chance to win this. And we were also in August saying that the polling data was wrong. And, it's, again, I guess, as I said before, I put a lot of time and effort into this. And that's something the mainstream news wasn't doing at that point. In August, everyone in the mainstream said it's a lock for Hillary Clinton. And we were one of the few dissenting voices out there. And that was based specifically on looking at the betting odds for who would win individual states and correlating them to the polling data. And it didn't match up. So the betting odds, which is a little more, what I consider a more reliable indicator, because people, you got to have skin in the game. You can't just answer a phone call and say, I'm going to vote for Clinton or Trump. You've got to actually put a, calculated financial position. That was indicating that the race was a lot closer than the, scientific polling data was.
And there are a lot of X factors in this particular. I mean, I wonder how difficult it's going to be to handicap this particular presidential election, because you've got the COVID-19 outbreak. You've got the ongoing struggles now with in the post-George Floyd era.
Sure.
And how that's going to impact the Trump administration and their handling of it versus the Biden camp that's going to leverage that for votes. And so I wonder how, I mean, those are X factors that I'm not sure necessarily, unless you're talking about polling data, that it's going to be, how difficult would it be to weave that into your odds making, these X factors?
Yeah, those are good points. But I personally think it's going to be deja vu all over again. I think, the reality now is that only 50% of the population vote for president. The voting turnout's down around 50%. And it's basically a turnout game. And it's basically a matter of which candidate energizes their base more to get out and vote for him. And like him or not, Trump's supporters are more enthusiastic about him than Biden's supporters are about him. And so I think you're going to see a very similar dynamic to 2016 without the, there's a few things I think could boost Biden's turnout and the enthusiasm around his campaign. Probably selecting an African-American running mate would be one of them. But, I still think that as a party, the Democratic presidential candidate just doesn't generate the enthusiasm among his core constituency that Trump does. And again, I'm pretty much apolitical. I don't really like either of them, but you gotta, whether you like him or not, his supporters are very enthusiastic. I don't see a lot of pickup trucks with big flags on the back saying Biden. And you see those, you see quite a few. I'm sure you see those out in Batesburg, Leesville. I see a few around Lexington, big Trump flags on the back of pick-em-up trucks.
Well, yes, that is true. And I have to admit, I don't see a whole lot of flags flying off of Biden flags.
Yeah, especially here in South Carolina.
Volvos or whatever. So, it should be a very interesting season. Matter of fact, if you'll consent, we'll have you back closer to the election day, and we'll talk about how the line's looking on Trump versus Biden.
Hey, that'd be great. I always enjoy talking about. It's funny. I really don't enjoy following politics, but I enjoy the predictive element of it. And not to get off on a tirade here, but presidential betting has a really long history in the United States. And at one point in the early 20th century, that was how the media tracked who was winning the election, was following the betting odds for president. And at one point, the New York Election Commission ran the presidential betting operation in the financial district in New York. And these are things I've just found out. I kind of consider myself a historian of the gambling industry. And these are things I've just found out in the past few years. And there's a really long, fascinating history about presidential betting and here in the United States. So that's a tease for my next appearance talking about presidential politics.
Man, I wish I'd put $10 down on Millard Fillmore.
Yeah, exactly.
My grandkids would be, "Whoa, you're set. Granddad put $10 down on Millard Fillmore. Yeah, everything's fine."
You'd have a bust of Millard in your palatial mansion then. And, yeah.
I would. If I put $10 down on Millard Fillmore, there's no question.
Yeah, I would definitely.
I think it'd be set for life.
Yeah, I think
James Murphy, sportsinsider.com. Tell folks a little bit about the site, what they can do, how they can get there. I know that they just got to type in the URL, but what happens when they go to sportsinsider.com?
Basically, it's there's a lot of sites on the internet that purport to be sports betting experts or whatever, but I've been in this industry for 20 plus years. In every aspect of it, I've been in every media outlet talking about it, from the Wall Street Journal to Fox News to, you name it. I was in Broadway News and Dance.com talking about the Tony Awards and Dancing with the Stars. So when you go to our site, you get legitimate sports betting experts. We're not really trying to sell you our picks. We're not trying to, hype anything. We provide what I think is some of the best analysis on the internet, not only of sports, but of the industry. We're always talking about how sports betting is growing in the United States and which state will legalize it next. And again, it's something I put a lot of pride into. I put a lot of pride in my writing and analysis, and it's very good stuff. If you're interested in the topic, I think we do it as well as anyone on the internet.
Sounds good, man. SportsInsider.com, James Murphy, and I'll check it out and see if you got anything going on the new season of Chopped. So I was actually going to get to that. That's on my list of things to set odds for. I've done I've done Top Chef and all the other shows. So it's Chopped I could do. All right. Well, that's
better if I have time to get to it.
Food Network and SportsInsider.com.
Yep.
That's good. Like mashed potatoes and gravy. Okay, James Murphy, I appreciate it, man. Thanks so much for visiting with me. I really have enjoyed this, and we will talk closer to November, whatever it is.
Yeah, I don't know the date, but I'll look forward to it.
Sounds good. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of TCN Around Town, the Twin City News podcast. It's been one of my favorites, I got to say. This has been fascinating. I hope to have James back again real soon. And don't forget to check us out online, all of our other various things that we're working on. And I've got some announcements on the return of our print edition coming up soon. And I've got another exciting announcement for you. Another digital product we're working on that I hope that you'll enjoy. That's got to do it. And as I always say, take care of somebody else, take care of yourself, and above all else, love somebody today. I'll see you tomorrow.